Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Eugene Stefanov. I'm a part of the marketing team at Perficient, and I'm very excited that you've joined us for today's webinar in which we'll discuss clinical study migration. Before we cover some basic housekeeping items and move on to a brief overview of Perficient, I'll mention that we are recording today, so in the next day or so we'll be sure to email you with information on how to access this presentation. All participants on this call will be in listen-only mode. This means that everyone is on mute. You can submit questions to the speakers at any time today by typing them in the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please make sure you state your questions clearly, and keep in mind other webinar participants will not see who asked which question. Your questions to the speaker will be anonymously addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. If you still have unanswered questions after the webinar or would like to request information about our capabilities, feel free to email Jessica Knowles, who is a member of our marketing team, and her email address will be listed in the presentation that you'll receive. You can also fill out the contact form on Perficient's website. Now that we've covered the logistics, let's just move on to a quick overview of our company. So who are we? We are a consulting firm that delivers digital experience, business optimization, and industry solutions. The work we do helps cultivate and captivate customers as well as drive efficiency and productivity. We have numerous locations across the US and Europe, as well as offshore facilities in India and China. A couple of stats. We were founded in 1997. Perficient is a public company that's traded on the NASDAQ, and we have nearly 3,000 employees. We've also formed strategic partnerships with major technology vendors and have dedicated solution and industry practices. One of these industry practices is, of course, life sciences. This graphic shows our depth of experience. You can see that we have relationships with 37 of the world's largest life sciences companies, and this is according to the Forbes 2000 list. So 37 of the largest biotech, pharma, med device, CROs that are on the Forbes 2000, they are currently working with us. So I'm not going to go into more detail about our experience on this call, but you are welcome to look at the slide more closely when you receive the link to the presentation. All right, now that I've covered the housekeeping items and told you a little bit about Perficient, I'd like to pass it over to today's speakers, Tammy Dutkin and Richard Gavin.
Hi everybody, this is Tammy Dutkin. I am the Director of Clinical Data Management and Electronic Data Capture for Perficient. I've been in the clinical research field for over 25 years. In my previous life, I was a VP of a full-service CRO as well as the VP of a biometrics CRO. So my love of data management has been long-standing. I've been with Perficient for a little over 5 years. Richard?
Hi, everyone. My name is Richard Gavin. I'm a solutions architect at Perficient, and my role includes work on technical implementations, data migrations, customizations, and a bit of software development here and there. I'm typically involved in project-based assignments, but I also work on our hosting operations and support our internal infrastructure.
All right, so today we're going to cover some information about study migration. We're going to talk about what study migration is, the reasons why you may want to do a study migration. We'll go through some pre-planning steps of things you need to consider when you're trying to decide to do study migration. We'll go through an overview of the process that we've used on multiple projects over the past couple of years. We will talk about validation, technical and business considerations, just a high-level overview of some things that you need to keep in mind when you're doing study migrations. And we'll cover a couple of case studies of ones that we've actually done. So what is study migration? Study migration involves moving a clinical study from one database to another database. From our experience, we've been doing mostly Oracle Clinical study migrations, where we've been moving from one Oracle Clinical instance into another Oracle Clinical database and moving everything involved with a particular study. This has been based on multiple clients' requests. We've developed a process using Data Pump to export a study in its entirety from one database to another. This includes not only the data itself, but the database objects, the user accounts, audit trails, and journaling records. All of that is moved in one migration.
I'll go ahead and cover this slide. So the migration process we've developed uses Oracle's latest export-import tool called Data Pump. Oracle Data Pump is an industry standard tool for moving data between Oracle databases. The software exports data in a binary format and is built around performance with safeguards in place to ensure a consistent export. Correct use of Oracle Data Pump allows a database administrator to reliably extract a set of database tables from a single point in time. So the tool uses what's called a PAR file, also known as a parameter file, which is essentially your configuration for what you want to export. This file specifies the list of tables and their filters. The filters allow for exporting only a subset of records in a table, which is the key component that allows us to move only individual studies or a subset of studies. These filters can be based on study, user, or for those of you familiar with OC, glib domain. If you're familiar with SQL, this is essentially the where clause of a select statement. So you have a list of tables and a list of where clauses for each table specifying which records to export from that table. Most tables are filtered by study, the vast majority. However, a number of tables must be filtered by user, especially ones that are related to the clinical audit trail, and some are filtered by domain. There are a small number of tables that have no filter. These mostly consist of non-clinical reference or configuration data. For example, you may be familiar with reference code lists. This is a table where you can't really filter by study or by user. That's on the export side of things. On the import side, there is a set of PAR files or parameter files that are also used to prevent conflicts with existing seed data or factory data. In more complex cases that I'll go into more detail later, you use these PAR files for the import to prevent conflicts with existing study data if the database you're importing into already has studies in it. So along with the list of tables and their filters, the user-based filters rely on a list of users that needs to be generated. This is a list of users that have ever touched a study and are implicated in the audit trail. So we have a script that goes through and queries various audit-related fields, such as modified by. These are constrained by study and domain-related filters to capture all the users that have become associated with the study to be migrated in one way or another. So this list of users, the user-based filter, it's especially key to exporting the audit trail. For example, you may be familiar with the Oracle Accounts table, or if you know the front end, there's an Oracle Accounts screen where you can see the user accounts, which maps to that table. This table is used to create a mapping between user IDs or usernames and the first name and last names of the associated persons. So essentially, it's a table that maps usernames to identities. As you may know, being able to resolve a user ID to an identity is important to fulfill regulatory requirements. This list of users can also inform which user accounts, which user database accounts need to be migrated. Note that these are separate from the accounts, from the records in the Oracle accounts table. Now, OC lends itself to customization and allows for custom validation and derivation procedures. Any external programs called by these, for example, packages, functions, and other dependencies that are implicated, such as database synonyms, views, need to be migrated as well if you want to retain that functionality. You also need to consider integration points, for example, email notifications or data extraction jobs that may be present in the source database. These need to be taken into consideration, and either you need to migrate them appropriately or retire them to take care of them. Next, we have database sequences and seed numbers. So Oracle Clinical uses what's called a seeded record identifier, which is the sequence number used for the primary key column of the table. This type of setup, the seeding of these identifiers, is done by design in support of replication and migration. When an OC database is first installed, a seed number is selected, and many sequences in the database use the seed number to populate record IDs. So for example, if the seed number 42 was picked at the initial installation of the database, all identifiers using seeded sequences would end in the number 42, whereas another database might use a seed number of 8. This prevents conflicts between the records into those two databases. So if you were migrating into an empty database, it would be sufficient to simply use a different seed number in the new database. That way the same sequences are not reused. However, if you're migrating into a non-empty database, that is a database that already has studies in it, things are a bit more complicated, and I'll go into a little more detail in a later slide. Finally, some tables do not, for whatever reason, actually use these seeded sequences, and these must be migrated separately, ensuring that the target sequence is greater than any number that had been used in the source database sequence to prevent future conflicts. Finally, last couple of items. You need to consider study version and upgrades. When data is being migrated, it needs to be brought up to the same version as the target database. You need to match the data model. You need to match the database structure. If migrating into an empty database, you can simply create the target at the same OCRDC version as the source. But a lot of companies in these cases take the opportunity to perform an upgrade as well, since the work is already being performed. And if the target database is not empty, things can be a little bit more complicated because you have to upgrade the data first. And so this last bullet refers to that more complex situation. I've mentioned a number of times that things can be more complicated when you're migrating into a non-empty database. Additional steps, such as the use of a staging database and a conflict analysis, are required in this more complex scenario. I'll, again, go into more detail about this later. And that's the slide.
All right. So there's many reasons why you may want to do study migration. For example, one of our clients does study migration for archiving purposes. So they take studies that are locked and frozen, and they move them into a separate database so that they can then delete them from their production database, and then it's saved in this archived instance for their database. We've had several clients that there's been a transfer of responsibility. Either the sponsor changes, so for example, maybe the licensing for the drug has been moved from sponsor A to sponsor B, and so now all of those studies involved with that drug need to be moved to sponsor B's database and removed from sponsor A's. Sometimes there's a CRO change, so it could be that a CRO that a company was working for, maybe they've decided to move it in-house, maybe they've decided to switch CROs. For whatever reason, maybe they need to move it from one vendor to another. Another reason may be for moving to a cloud or hosted solution. Maybe the decision has been made that you're going to be decommissioning your database and you have a few long-standing studies that are going to be running for several years, and you want to move just those particular studies to a hosted solution so that your hosted provider can maintain those studies for you, and you can move on to whatever your next CDMS solution may be. I know that's happening more and more, particularly with clients that are using Oracle Clinical. It could be a consolidation of your databases. So if you're a larger company and you've had a lot of acquisitions or partnerships, maybe every company has a different version and a different instance of their database, and you'd like to move them all into one environment. This could be because you need to streamline, or you need to work on some sort of consolidation of processes and working on your standards. There could be a reason that you need to consolidate multiple databases into one single instance. Platform change is a big thing going on right now. So although we're talking a lot about Oracle Clinical and moving from one Oracle Clinical instance to another, this same process and the same methodology could be used for moving from, say, Oracle Clinical and then migrating that data into an entirely different platform like Inform or Rave or some other platform change. So the same methodology could be used for doing that as well. So before you decide whether you're going to do study migration or not, you need to do some risk-benefit analysis. It's not cheap to do these migrations. It takes a lot of time. There is some risk, and you will have some downtime of your studies. So while we're migrating the studies from one instance to another, you're going to have some study downtime. And does that fit into everybody's schedules? If you're migrating into a database that already has data in it, keep in mind that for that migration time of migrating these new studies into that database, all of your studies will be down for a period of time. We've been able to cut our downtime usually to 4 days for a long weekend. But depending on the complexity and the number of studies and what you've decided for your validation testing, et cetera, it could be a week that you're down between the two before you take it down in one environment and bring it up in another environment. You want to make sure that you get input from all applicable team members. Often the decisions are made from an IT perspective or from a select group on your clinical team, but you're not taking in consideration the impact that this may have on other groups. So make sure that you're getting input from everybody when you're trying to assess your risk benefits, to make sure that everybody has some input on what they view as their risks. You need to make sure that you set up a formal communication channel and escalation plans early. When you're moving studies, it can be pretty complicated, and you want to make sure that you have the right team members that you can contact when questions arise, and that if something goes wrong, you have an escalation plan of who needs to be notified and how that notification needs to go. Make sure that you understand the requirements. Is your requirement that you're closing your Oracle Clinical database down and you have 2 studies that are going on for 5 years? and you want to move those into a separate hosted environment so that you can move on to your other technology but still have these studies ongoing, understand what those requirements are and make sure that you're setting reasonable goals. The migration's not going to happen in a month's time. You're going to require a lot of steps to get to the point that you're ready to do your production migration. So you want to make sure that you have reasonable goals set. And that you create an overall timeline. So, one of our clients said, we absolutely have to have this done before the end of the year. So, we tried to work our way back to set up the goals and make sure that we had enough people on board to get that done in the timeline that they required. But, it did take a lot of people to, sacrifice weekends, et cetera, to try to get that done. So you want to make sure that you're setting reasonable goals, you have the team to get it done, and that you create an overall timeline and make sure that that's communicated to everybody. You also need to make sure that you understand any conflicting priorities. So if you're going to be taking a database down and there's other studies that are in there, you absolutely need to take account, when that downtime is going to be and what impact it may have on the other studies that are going to be offline for a period of time. So make sure that you have those all set, and known at the very beginning so that, that would be part of your risk-benefit analysis as well. So the overall process that we used when we have done that, and we've done quite a few in the past couple of years. The first part, obviously, is planning. You always have to do some project planning, but you also need to plan from a validation perspective of what your requirements are going to be for testing and for documentation. You want to make sure that you plan that ahead of time so that you're well prepared for making sure that you document what it is that you're planning on doing. Then you have a period of analysis, and this is doing some analysis on the technical side of things, analyzing your business requirements, and doing some analysis on the validation side as well. And I'll go into more details what each of these are involved in the further slides. The next stage, which kind of goes along with analysis, is the development stage. So you're going to have to develop your export and import process. You're going to have to develop your installation. If you're doing an upgrade, you need to develop that as well so that you have your process well documented, and any sort of logs, et cetera, or instructions, you got to make sure that those are all written before you get started. Also, whatever testing you've decided to do, there may be some additional testing scripts that you need to write, either for the migration or for an upgrade. You want to make sure you have your testing documentation in place too. Then you're going to want to do a dry run and informal testing. And it's really important that you do this informal testing before you move to formal validation, because I guarantee when you do it, you're going to come across things that you didn't think about when you were doing your planning and your analysis. All of a sudden something's not working right, and you're going to have to dig a little bit further to figure out why. And you may need to go back to the development stage to tweak some of your documents, certainly your process, your testing scripts, et cetera. When you do the dry run and informal testing, you're going to dry run all of your testing scripts, and you're also going to dry run that export-import process and any of your installation and upgrade plans as well. Once you're sure that you have everything in place, all of your documents are from the development phase are finalized and signed off, then you're going to move to your formal validation. The majority of your time is going to be from this planning to the dry run stage. Once you get to the validation, if you've done enough dry runs and enough testing ahead of time, your validation should go smoothly. You should be able to execute your migration and your installation into a validation environment, and then you're going to formally document any of your testing, whether you're doing installation qualifications, operational qualifications, performance qualifications, migration qualifications, whatever testing that you're doing, you're going to make sure that you execute it and formally document it. Once you've validated your process formally, then you can move to the production and go live. You're going to follow this pretty much the same steps you did. You're going to execute the migration and installation into a prod database, and you're going to formally document this. Usually you're testing in production because you've already formally validated the process. Your testing in production is much less. This is going to require downtime from both your the target or the source database side and from the target side. So you need to make sure that you plan that time appropriately. And then once that's all done, then you have your closeout and your hypercare where you're doing your summary support or your summary reports, and then you're supporting all of the new users for the new system so that in case anybody has login issues or questions, you want to make sure that you can support that. Okay, so let's look at some of these things a little bit more closely. Okay, so the first part of the process we talked about is planning. So one of the things you're going to want to plan is your validation plan. What I've listed here are the documents that we use as part of our validation process. Obviously, whatever your validation process is, your documents may be called something different. Your software development lifecycle may require other steps for you. But for us, this involves creating a validation plan, which is just a summary of what it is we are planning on doing from a validation perspective. Next, we create multiple protocols, whether they're installation qualification protocols. If we're going to be doing an upgrade as part of the migration, we may have OQPQ protocols. We'll definitely have a migration protocol. And this is going to talk about what we're going to do in order to ensure that the migration goes smoothly and that the database is functioning as we expect. Along with the protocol, we're going to have other documents like a requirement specification and test case developments and stuff for our actual migration testing. Okay, so that's part of our validation planning. We also need to plan the project overall. We need to come up with a complete project plan that's going to have tasks, dates, and specific resources named. You don't want to just put a role in there. You want to actually assign it to someone because you need to make sure that that person is going to be available and has the time set aside to do whatever tasks are assigned to them. We also try to put a formal communication plan in place. This includes, when our regularly scheduled meetings are going to be, who all our contacts are with all of their contact information, and then it will also include an escalation plan of, if this goes wrong, then these people need to be contacted. If we can't get a hold of this person, then we go to this person. So make sure that you have a plan in place for how this project's going to go. Make sure that you take into account resource availability, holidays, study timelines, and any deliverables to make sure that you're scheduling the production downtime for something that works for everybody and not just for part of your team. And then one of the big portions of this initial phase is this entire analysis phase. So on the technical side, you have to determine, which tables are going to be migrated and what the filter requirements are going to be for those tables. You'll have to work with the source, who's ever holding the source database, because their filter requirements may be different. So we had, one client who, they had a company that was a spinoff, and so they were pretty open in being able to share with this other organization because it was a spinoff company, and so they felt comfortable pretty much just sharing all tables with really minimal filters on them for some of the global tables. But we've worked with other sponsors where there was a huge, there was two totally different sponsors. The drug licensing was going from one sponsor to another, and they had a highly customized database, and they didn't feel comfortable sharing some tables, and they really did not, they really wanted to make sure they put, pretty restrictive filters on those tables. So you have to open up those lines of communication. You have to do analysis of what people are willing to share and being able to determine which tables you're going to be able to get. You also want to review any integration points. So, if you're moving from one database to another and it's internal, and internally you always use JReview to do your analysis, well, you need to make sure then that your JReview is going to be able to work in this new database that you're setting up for these other two studies if that's part of your normal process. You also want to make sure that you review any custom programming that may be impacted by migration. Richard talked a little bit about, your custom tables or programs that are called upon from validation or derivation procedures. So you need to find out, what is going to be impacted by the migration. Can we get copies of those custom programs so that we can use those moving forward so that those programs will still work once we do the migration? Or is that something that's not going to be shared, and then how is that process or how is that edit check needs to be reprogrammed in order to work in the new database? You need to determine how user accounts and roles and study security, et cetera, will be migrated. If you're migrating into a database that already has data, you're also going to have to do some sort of conflict analysis to find out what impact on the in the target database for studies that are already in there, what impact could it possibly have on those studies, and making sure that you figure out where the conflicts are going to be and how those conflicts are going to be resolved. From the business side of things, you really want to make sure that you review any downstream processes that may be impacted by the migration. For example, we did a migration for one client, and after the migration was done, there was a clinical group that had previously been getting a specific report from the original owners of the database, and that report no longer worked. Well, we didn't know that was part of the requirements to have that report up and running. And so it's really important that as part of this analysis, again, that you get everybody involved in the discussions and make sure that any of those downstream processes are taken in consideration, and that you've figured out either whether that team needed to be communicated, that they had to come up with a different way to get that information, or whether you assured that report was going to be able to run post-migration. But you need to take into account those processes as you're doing your analysis. Another important consideration is if you are upgrading your system, how are your users going to be trained on that new system? So if you're moving, if in the current source database they're on RDC 4.6.6, and you're going to upgrade them to 5.1, and so when during production cutover, when the database comes up and the users are given access to the new system, it's 5.1. I mean, there's some pretty big navigation differences between the two systems, so you want to make sure that your users are going to be trained appropriately. If you have brand new users that are going to be, that weren't part of the study previously but are going to be using it after the migration is complete, make sure that they're going to be trained on how to use the system before that day one when the system goes live in the new database and they're given access to it. Determine how the system changes and downtimes are going to be communicated to users. You want to let them know, okay, this database is going to be down over this weekend, and then just prior to that weekend, you're going to send out another notification to let them know, okay, so the link that you previously were using for this study for RDC is now no longer going to be available, and starting on Monday, you will be sent a new link with a new user ID and password, however you want to communicate that, and then after the system goes live, who will be doing that communication. So a lot of preparation to make sure that you're ready to bring the system up and running, and you have minimal impact to your users. You also need to do some analysis on the validation side. So you need to understand, based on the tables that are going to be migrated, what specifically is going to be migrated, what's not going to be migrated. What are the risks, and how are we going to mitigate those risks, and what strategies are we going to use to deal with things that aren't going to be migrated. We want to develop a migration requirement specification. So we know that there's going to be a really restrictive filter on something specific, and we need to test to make sure that that filter doesn't negatively impact our ability to be able to use that database moving forward. So there's the analysis part is really intense. A lot of different things are discovered. You need to make sure you have the right personnel that are doing the analysis, that understand what's happening in the source, that understand things from a business side, from a validation side, from a technical side, and that they're all talking to one another during that analysis process. Development. Now, after you've done your initial analysis portion, in conjunction, you're going to be doing the development. Now, we would recommend doing this in a temp environment. You can do it in the validation environment. You would just need to roll it back, and keep in mind you're going to have to keep refreshing it as you're developing your different parameter files, et cetera. You have to develop your data pump parameter files, your plans and scripts for transfer of external programs, et cetera. You need to, your install and upgrade instructions have to be developed. Any testing documents will need to be written, and that includes both your migration testing and any supplemental testing documents. So, for example, one of our clients had some custom user roles, so we had to do some specific testing on the user roles. Or if they're using an integration like JReview or something, you may need to add some additional testing to ensure that those integration points are still working post-migration. There may be a necessity to do some post-migration cleanup. So maybe there's some procedures that were not being provided the back-end programs for, and so those procedures we need to retire or make provisional when they are moved into the new target database, because once we move them into the target, if we leave them on there, they're going to cause the batch to keep failing every time we try to run it. You may need to reset your TMS dictionary objects if you have new dictionaries that are going to be loaded on the TMS side. So once you've decided during the analysis how you're going to handle some of these things, some of them may be handled in kind of some cleanup that's done after the migration has been completed. Once you have developed those documents, you're going to want to do a dry run and informal testing. And like I said, this can really save you a ton of time once you get to the validation portion. If you do your dry run successfully, when you get to your validation, when you get to your actual formal validation, that should run smoothly and hopefully not take a ton of time. You're going to want to make sure that you dry run everything. So dry run your installation scripts. Dry run your export-import scripts. Make sure that you transfer the files that you're going to be using during validation. Do a dry run of your cleanup document. Do a dry run of all your test cases. And then you're going to want to finalize all of those after they've been dry run. Keep in mind that during this process, during the analysis, the development, and the dry run, you're going to be doing transfers probably every couple of days. I mean, for one of our clients, I think because we were having so many restrictions on the tables, and, I think we transferred one day, we transferred like 3 times in one day. So keep in mind that your resources on both sides are going to have to be available. If your resource that's doing the import doesn't have the ability to export from the source database, maybe they don't have access, then whoever has access to that source database needs to be readily available so that when we run into an issue and we try to tweak it, that somebody is available to transfer those files so that testing isn't held up any further. Once we get to the formal validation of the migration, we're going to follow pretty much the same steps that we did for the dry run. We're going to do an installation of the validation environment if that's needed, if this is a new environment. We're going to run the export scripts in the source database using data pump and any scripts involving the external programs, etc. We'll transfer the files. We'll do an import into the target database. We're going to execute the cleanup document, execute any of the testing, and then the results of those testings will be summarized in a summary report. Once your formal validation is complete, then you're ready to do the actual production cutover. Now keep in mind when you you're going to want to remove access to the study in the source database prior to actually once you do your migration, because at that point you don't want anybody making changes on the source database side, because once the export is run, then all of your data is going to be in this new target database. So it's important that you're going to remove access from the study in the source database. you run your export scripts in the source database, transfer the files. You'll import the files into the target database. You'll execute your post-migration cleanup again. And then you're going to execute any of your testing that's required according to your validation planning. And again, usually we normally do our production cutover. We try to do it over a weekend. That way it has the minimal impact to a sponsor. We've seen this take anywhere from 3 days to taking a full week. But it really depends on what's required for the testing, how many other times we've done migrations for this database, and what our process is going to be. For the closeout and hypercare, so to close out, once we're done with the move from production to migration or into the production database, we're going to summarize the results in our summary reports, and then we release the system to the users. To release the system in the users, you have to notify the users what the new URLs are for accessing the database. You'd have to notify the users if they're, we kept their user accounts the same if they already had an account, but we reset everybody's passwords so that they were forced to, reset the password when they, first time that they logged in. But there's many ways that you can handle that release of the system to the users. For hypercare, just be prepared to provide extended support to assist users who may have to log or may have problems logging in or have questions about the system themselves, especially if you're doing an upgrade or you have a lot of new users. Make sure that they've had their training ahead of when the go live is going to be, but also make sure that there's, they have the number for a support, either a help desk or a team of people that they can access if they have questions about how to get into the system. So for the process itself, that was pretty much the process that we followed. You need to consider multiple points when you're doing those steps. There's a lot of considerations that we have come across for special cases and things that we've learned along the way. So we're hoping to share some of that with you guys so you can avoid some of the pitfalls. For validation considerations, it's really important that you process fully what the plan is going to be. You have to plan ahead of time and then make sure that you summarize what your actual results are. When you're documenting what your plan is, make sure that your QA or CSV or whatever team is putting together your validation plan, that they have input from both technical and business subject matters to ensure that when you're documenting the process, particularly for the migration, that it has a lot of detail in it. But it's also in language that everybody can understand. You can use a risk-based approach, but if you make decisions to test or not test or to migrate, not migrate, et cetera, you need to make sure that you fully document what those reasons are. So for example, for one of our clients, we made a decision not to migrate the lab subsystem, and then it turned out after go live that we really should have migrated the one table in the lab subsystem because a few data entry records at one point had been assigned or it had been entered the lab name, even though they weren't using the lab subsystem that was named. Well, because we hadn't migrated that table, we weren't able to open up those records. And this wasn't discovered until after go live, and so we had to do a post change and migrate that separate table all by itself after go live, which is obviously not ideal. So make sure that you're fully documenting. I mean, luckily, we had some documentation in place that documented that decision of why we decided not to migrate that table. But you want to make sure that all those decisions are fully documented in your plan so that, if by some chance it's years later that you discover something, you want to be able to go back and figure out why it was that you made that decision. make sure that you follow whatever your software development lifecycle process is. Our process includes a plan or a protocol for everything and then a summary report to summarize the results. And we have an overall validation plan that's kind of bookends where it documents kind of all of the protocols that are going to be followed underneath it. If you're doing, if you're migrating into a database that already has data, maybe instead of doing all these plans and protocols, you're just going to have a single change plan and a single change summary report. So really it depends on what your processes are, but make sure that you're following your SOPs on that. Richard?
So technical considerations. As we've mentioned a couple times, and I want to emphasize here too, it's really important to provide adequate time for development and informal testing, and to be prepared for multiple exports from the source system. This helps find issues with customizations that might not be immediately apparent, or may be the source owners were not aware of those customizations. And it helps prevent issues during the validation phase. By doing all this work up front, you save yourself headaches later on. You want to confirm the list of tables and associated filters with the current owners of the study and the future owners, if they're different. The owners need to be comfortable with the set of data that is being transferred, and you don't want any surprises when you get to, for example, the production phase, and then they say, oh, why are we moving this table, or why is this filter so unrestrictive? By making sure everyone's comfortable ahead of time, you avoid problems like that down the line. It's important that the list of users that I talked about earlier that's used in the user-based filter includes all the users that have ever touched a study or currently have access to it, to ensure that all of the audit trail details, which are contained in the OC journaling tables, are in fact captured. This is important for preserving the clinical audit trail. And then resetting passwords of existing users and distributing credentials. Generally, we have found that an easy and secure method of migrating users involves simply creating new passwords, although it is possible to migrate existing users along with their password hashes. But we found that the most straightforward method is simply to just reset all the passwords and then communicate the new credentials to those users in a secure fashion. And finally, probably one of the biggest technical considerations is whether you're going to be migrating into an empty database or a database with existing studies. The motivations for this can include sharing of global library objects, for example. If everything is in the same database, you can share the same objects across studies. There may be licensing considerations. Depending on the type of licensing you have, multiple Oracle databases can incur additional licensing fees. So some clients choose to get everything into one database to minimize costs, but that makes things more complex. For example, you have to, of course, ensure that the source and target have different seed numbers, but in the case of an empty database, it's sufficient to just make sure they're different. But when you're migrating into a non-empty database, a database that already has studies in it, existing records must be queried to determine all the seed numbers that have ever been used, and to ensure incoming data does not conflict, to ensure that the records coming in, that their identifiers do not conflict, and that the seed number you pick will never conflict with any of the pre-existing records. Also, you want to perform a conflict analysis for global records. So you consider a table or a set of data such as responses, which is the responses to the various questions in your DCMs. Those responses are filtered by study. So you'll never find a conflict there because the clinical study ID will always ensure separation of those records. However, global library objects are not always study specific, and there are some other objects that aren't filterable by study or, for example, by user. And for those, you need to compare the records that are coming in and see if any of them have any conflicts to prevent any kind of duplicates. So normally we run a comparison that it's a scripted comparison that compares the source records to the target records, and it produces a report which highlights which records conflict. So you'll see the source record, like in an Excel spreadsheet, and you'll see the target record, and you'll see the differences highlighted. For example, this record has a different address. This investigator has a different address in the source, and in the target, their address is different. Which one do you want to keep? And in our experience, probably the simplest situation is when you want to keep the target records, to keep the data that's already in the database. It is, of course, possible to update the target with the source record. However, this increases the complexity a bit. Finally, global audit trail data becomes a little bit more complex when you're importing into a database that already has studies. Now, when I say global audit trail data, I mean the audit trail data that cannot be filtered by the study ID. In these cases, you need to make a decision how this is going to be handled, because it's not possible to tell programmatically necessarily which audit trail data would need to be migrated in from the source and which pieces were already there. In some cases, you might be able to do it by the date, for example, but this has its own risks. What we have found is that probably the most straightforward way of handling this is to treat the incoming data as new, the incoming global data as new records, and simply enable the OC audit trails during the import of the new global data so that it gets cataloged within those audit trails. All right, a couple more points. Again, customizations and integrations. You want to migrate all the database objects that are used by the study in OC. These can include views, procedures, functions, database synonyms that are used in the various parts of OC, such as derivation validation procedures, extract macros, etc. This kind of relies on, there are parts of this analysis you can do programmatically, for example, by querying the procedure text, and you can go a long ways to determine what all of the dependencies are. However, it is extremely helpful if the owners of the current study have documentation and knowledge of any customization and dependencies that might exist in the source database. And you have some custom logos as well in the CRF layouts that you'll want to migrate. And if the URL is changing, you may need to update the RDC news table along with migrating the various files such as PDFs or other RDC news items. and of course take into consideration the fact that you may need to upgrade the source data. And you also want to look at whether the source database matches the character set of the target database. The character set refers to the encoding of the text data in the source database. It can be encoded in different ways. There are multiple standards. Probably the most popular one nowadays is called UTF-8. However, in the past, other character sets were used, and you need to ensure that the data gets converted to match the target character set. So there's an Oracle tool that we use to perform this type of analysis in terms of the character set. In some cases, if the character sets are not compatible, this process may involve replacing some characters. For example, you might have to convert a curly quote to a straight quote. Or, for example, you may have an accented character that needs to be converted to a non-accented character.
All right, thanks, Richard. So we are running close to being out of time here. I have this last slide on business consideration, which I think we've covered pretty much of these points already throughout the presentation. The next few slides are just a couple of case studies. I'm not going to share with those online just because I want to be conscious of everybody's time, and I know that they may need to log out here right at 10 o'clock Central. So we will make this presentation available online so that you can review those case studies yourself. We are also out of time and can't address people's questions. So we will take those questions and we will be following up with the people with those questions individually. So I apologize. As you can see, this is a huge topic matter. We do have a few other webinars coming out to get some more specifics on these topics. We have one coming up on August 3rd that will address the validation and business considerations more in depth, and we can go through those case studies at that point. And then we will also be doing one more specific on the technical considerations for that as well. Eugene, do you have anything else that you want to wrap up with?
No, I think that sums it up nicely. Just keep your eye out for the presentation. It'll be sent either today or tomorrow. And we'll answer the questions that were received. We'll follow up with you guys personally. And again, just feel free to register for the other webinars that are coming up. And we thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and we hope that you found this information very helpful. Thank you, Tammy. Thank you, Richard, for presenting today. I appreciate that.